Welcome back to a new lecture. We are going over topic 1.6, that is cultural interactions between Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans. And the theme that shows up today is America in the world. The learning objective is explain how and why European and Native American perspectives of others developed and changed in the period. The first key concept says, in their interactions, Europeans and Native Americans asserted divergent worldviews regarding issues such as religion, gender roles, family, land use, and power. So, natives in North America were extremely diverse and different from each other, as we said in the early lectures. There were over 2,000 different language groups in North America, but they differed from Europeans in some significant ways. One of the most important is that all of them were not Christian. That one characteristic influenced Europeans' perception of natives and led to an inferior view of natives. Another main difference is that they did not place the same value on the same resources. While natives in the New World had access to gold in some parts, they really didn't place as much value on it as the Europeans did. Instead, they had other natural resources that they valued. Some natives used wampums as currency. Wampums were seashells that were rounded into beads that could be easily exchanged. Gender roles were also different between the two groups. Some native women had more political power than their counterparts in Europe. We've talked about how the Iroquois organized themselves along matrilineal lines, and the matriarch of a community would have power in choosing who the sachem, or the leader of that community, would have been. Finally, there were differences in the ownership of land, or perceptions of the ownership of land. While Europeans had a very rigid perception of private property ownership, some tribes lived in communal areas, so they shared all of the land. They utilized it for hunting, gathering, and agriculture, but that didn't mean that they believed any one person owned the land more than any other person. So these are going to be the things that are going to drive interactions between natives and Europeans. Based on all those differences, there were bound to be misunderstandings, and that's our next key concept. Mutual misunderstandings between Europeans and Native Americans often define the early years of interaction and trade, as each group sought to make sense of the other over time. Europeans and natives adopted some useful aspects of each other's culture. Some of the most famous misunderstandings happened in the Aztec Empire with Moctezuma and Hernan Cortés. Moctezuma was the leader of the Aztecs. He famously misinterpreted the presence of the Spanish in Mexico as a fulfillment of an Aztec prophecy. Moctezuma incorrectly believed that Hernan Cortés was the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl and let the Spanish into the city of Tenochtitlan. There was also misunderstandings on the side of the Europeans. Europeans saw gold and often spent a lot of effort in futile searches for gold deposits. In El Dorado, or the fabled city of gold, the city that did not exist, but it didn't stop the Spanish from continuing to send expeditions to find it. Another of these was the search for the Fountain of Youth. The Spanish explorer Ponce de Leon traveled all across the Florida peninsula in search of the Fountain of Youth and never found it. The thing that they gained from each other would have been horses and weapons. On the sides of the Native Americans, the natives who established friendly trade relations actually benefited from these European technologies and European horses. Once they traded for these weapons and horses, they were now able to use those resources against their old rivals. It offset the balance of power in the New World from what it was previous to Europeans' arrival. Europeans also established sugar plantations in the New World and sent back those crops that grew plentifully in the New World, or seeds for those crops, so that they could begin growing them in Europe. So that's potato, squash, corn, beans, and tomatoes. One main thing that really set off the increased rate of cultural exchange was the intermarriage of Spanish and natives. Remember, the Spanish explorers were mostly men and very few women came along in their expeditions. There were very few family units to settle. And as men were settling in the new Spanish Empire, they began to settle down and intermarry with the local population. As those relations of cultural exchange began to happen, they become intermediaries for new technologies to be adopted for natives and the introduction of New World crops and plants for Europeans. As European encroachment on Native American lands and demands on their labor increased, Native people sought to defend and maintain their political sovereignty, economic prosperity, religious beliefs, and concepts of gender relations through diplomatic negotiations and military resistance. This military resistance is something that we have to emphasize here, because the narrative so often becomes that the Spanish came over and they completely destroyed Native American societies, and natives succumbed because they were weaker. But in reality, there were some societies that were able to successfully stand up militarily against the Spanish, and this happened in modern-day New Mexico. At the time, this was the periphery or the very edge of the Spanish New World Empire. Because it was so far to the northern edge, it was more difficult for the Spanish to maintain control in that area. That's one of the things that helped the Pueblo people take back some sovereignty over their land. The main conflict here was that the Spanish were trying to limit religious rituals in the Pueblo area. This area goes as far north as Taos, New Mexico, and as far south as the city of Santa Fe. The Spanish are trying to restrict the use of Kachina idols. The Pueblo people banded together under Pope's rebellion, and they ousted the Spanish. They destroyed the Catholic churches that had been built in the area, and they were able to maintain control of the region for about 50 years before the Spanish came back. For our final key concept, extended contact with Native Americans and Africans fostered a debate among European religious and political leaders about how non-Europeans should be treated, as well as evolving religious, cultural, and racial justifications for the subjugation of Africans and Native Americans. We talked about this debate in the last lecture between Bartolomé de las Casas and Juan Guinness de Sepulveda. Sepulveda wanted to continue the encomienda system that enslaved natives on Spanish land grants in return for the Spanish landowners' efforts to convert them to Catholicism. Sepulveda didn't see anything wrong with it, while Bartolomé de las Casas thought that it was inhumane, especially because Native Americans showed a willingness, in his eyes, to convert, or at least the ones that he had encountered, showed a willingness to convert to Catholicism. He believed that they should not be enslaved because that would be against the teachings of the Bible, that Christians should not enslave other Christians. Eventually, the encomienda system comes to an end, but not without its replacement. The replacement was the repartimiento system, and this was only a less stringent version of the encomienda system. It wasn't as harsh on Native Americans under the repartimiento system. Natives had a little bit more freedom, but it was still a form of coerced labor. So as the Spanish were not able to use coerced native labor in the same way as before, they looked towards the Portuguese slave trade. The map on the screen shows the number of enslaved Africans that were brought to the New World across the entirety of the slave trade, and it totaled about 12.5 million people. The majority of them end up going to South America and to Brazil from West Central Africa, and a smaller number end up in Central America, the Caribbean, and then later on in North America. Just because the number is so much greater in South America doesn't mean that the enslaved African labor that the Spanish were bringing in the 1500s wasn't large in scale, especially relative to the amount of Spanish that were in the Caribbean. The Catholic Church opposed enslavement of natives because it viewed them as capable of conversion to Christianity, but it did not share the same view for Africans. The hub of the slave trade for North America will be in the West Indies or the Caribbean, and that name West Indies stuck even after everyone realized that Columbus had not landed in Asia. All right, here is your recap. So we have natives and Europeans differed greatly from one another. The continued contact in the New World led to a degree of cultural exchange. Natives pushed back in the interest of self-preservation, and the example you have to remember is the Pueblo people and Pope's rebellion. And finally, coerced labor sparked a moral and religious debate amongst Europeans, and you should be familiar with the Las Casas and Sepulveda and their debate and how it led to enslaved labor coming from Africa. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.